Hello, my name is Moses, and today's podcast I'll be interviewing James Bell, a photographer and a teacher of social studies at college. Hello, James. Be welcome.
So what questions have you got for me? Because I'm not quite sure. Could you just explain what it's about?
It's about your work and your perception about representativeness as well, media. Because I know that you are a photographer, and I know that you did your project about the Jamaican community as well, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit in relation to representation of Black representation overall, and that's continuing now. So some of the work that I did, I went to Brixton, and I tried to look at the process of gentrification within London, which was quite interesting. Because, as you know, house prices are increasing, and that's causing certain communities to struggle in London to continue. So the experience is that some of these communities have to leave. So the environment in central London with regards to Brixton is changing culturally and visually. So yeah, that was a good project, but a lot of what I'm doing, I sometimes feel as if I'm just skimming the surface and not doing enough, because I don't really have that much time because I have commitments to teaching. But yeah, that's, I've done quite a bit there.
Oh, good. And can you tell me about your project because you've got like the photography work as well with the models, that's kind of futuristic as well, don't you?
Yeah, I'm trying to look at the subject of Afrofuturism. So as a movement, this is something that I didn't know before the introduction of Black Panther, that there's a large body of people in America who are trying to reimagine what African and the diaspora identity would be outside the context of colonialism. So it's just that idea of imagining what Africa would be like if there were or was no colonialization. So what that's bringing about is an imagination of African identity outside of racism, and therefore it's kind of quite interesting because a lot of the representations, maybe also including Brazil, are influenced by the recent history to do with slavery.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Definitely is.
So that for me is kind of quite interesting because you're trying to imagine an unfettered society, if that makes sense.
Yeah, without the external influence as well, no?
Yeah. So it's kind of quite fun, but it's also serious at the same time. Because in your imagination, if you think of surrealism is just the unconstrained imagination. So you think of anything and you try to visualize it. So that's the fun bit, but then the serious bit is more to do with trying to bring forward in a futuristic way an African identity. So that could be in costume, in story, like narrative, some of the myths as well. So pardon me, in a lot of Afrofuturism, there's always a reference to the past as well as the future.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I was just going to say it's not just about models. So I'd just say it's a little bit deeper than that. But yeah,
no, it is. And James, can you tell me, because of course you are a photographer and you are a black man. I don't know how you identify yourself, because one of the things that I cross on my research is like it's like the ethnic groups in England, like in Britain, because in Brazil it's quite different. In Brazil we identify ourselves. Doesn't matter the color you are, but if you identify yourself as a black man, you can be black even if like your color of skin is white or this kind of things. It's more like a cultural background and actually like a physical character. And I want to ask you, like, from you, like, how do you identify yourself, like how your ethnic group and this kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, to be honest, that in terms of theory, because I do teach media studies, the understanding of race is meaningless, because all of the characteristics that people use to identify race sometimes fall down. So ethnicity is much more appropriate, and the determination of ethnicity is more linked to cultural values. So, you know, from that definition, you could be any color or have varying features, but still identify as being black. So I get it completely. However, you know, there are different layers. So from experience, certainly from the Jamaican experience, we have another thing which probably applies in Brazil, and it's a theory called colorism. And within the idea of colorism, there's the assumption that there can be prejudice even within the black identity or ethnicity, where some, you know, the determination of the color of a person's skin defines their social position within society, and we do see that in Jamaica.
We do see in Brazil as well. That's really clear in there as well. It's like it's more like a social issue than actually like it is a racial issue as well. But when we talk about race, that's actually more social than actually the race itself.
Yeah, I think all of these constructs are interconnected anyway. That you have race and class, and I don't know, some social issues.
And gender as well.
I think it's and gender, yeah. And I think it's those intersections which makes the subject of discussion of race not simplistic. It's rather complex.
It is. And James, how do you see, like, how is your perception about representativeness, like, here in Britain? Because how long are you here actually? Like, you were born here, don't you?
I was born in Britain. So that means that I've got over 50 years experience of living in Britain. And I think my understanding has changed over time. And that's partly been through experience. For disclosure, I have to kind of let you know that I grew up within foster care, So the people that I grew up with were actually white. So as a result, my perspective is a little bit different, I would say. And I think over time it has evolved. So my viewpoint has changed over time. So just to kind of explain just a little bit more, I would say that I probably grew up in an environment where you were encouraged to have the view that colour, I know I'm using that in sort of like a historical framework, doesn't really matter because we're all equal. But as you grow up and you see things differently and experience different things, you do understand that there are structural systems which basically mean that there are differences between ethnicities, and that prejudice and institutional racism is a very real thing. But when I was young, I didn't see it that way because I didn't have that experience. But I have changed in my perspective. Does that make sense?
It does. It completely does. And what was like the biggest issue like on your perception, like about your identity as well, like when you were young, like how was the perception you had about yourself into the world, and if you realized the perception you had was different than the perception of the others had about you, like you said that you didn't realize much like the difference in between ethnics when you were young. And do you think like the others had a different perception about you, and these things changed with the time or no?
Of course, what I'm saying is just off the top of my head, but I think that when you grow up, you're under the control of your parents and your family, and you are cocooned just a little bit and influenced by your parents' voice, which in my case was my foster parents, and their experience of race most likely was from the assumption that we treat everybody fairly. And I understand that to a degree, but I think there is some form of collective blindness in terms of some of the shortfalls of sort of like British identity and prejudice. So one of the things that I came across as I was growing up was my foster parents, or rather my mother, saying that Black people seem to struggle with issues linked to monogamy and so on and so forth. So there was a little bit of a judgment in terms of how Black people behaved. And as you grow up, you realize that there are a lot of structural reasons for the things that people observe, and therefore everything requires a context. So I kind of felt that I needed to understand things a little bit more. Another example would be the idea that sort of like European culture was at the top of the hierarchy and everything else was inferior. So the assumption was that that culture was resident within Greek and also Latin-based history, sort of the Romans and so on and so forth. But when you dig further and deeper, you see that the beginnings of language was not associated with Greece and Rome. You can track that back to the Phoenicians, and then again you can track further back and see that that there's a link to African and Egyptian signs and so on and so forth. So I think for me, it's just trying to get that context and that understanding of what is culture and where does it actually come from, and the contribution of all different races or ethnicities to this thing that we call culture. So again, a lot of what I'm understanding perhaps comes from a media studies environment, where we look at the timeline of the beginnings of language and history, etc., and we see that it comes from a variety of sources: Mesopotamia, China, Egypt, and also Europe. And let's be fair, you know, but it's not resident within one singular culture. And I think that that's great, because no one can claim superiority.
Exactly. Yeah, completely agree with you. Well, like, who are your references, and how do you think that affect your production as well, like your artwork?
Did you say influences?
Yeah, influences. And
yeah, okay. I don't know. I think there's so many, to be honest. Certainly in photography, if you talk to some of the lecturers, I was and still am all over the place, in terms of being a little bit like a magpie, and seeing the goodness and the greatness in a wide variety of artists. So to begin with, I think Nick Knight for fashion is definitely an influence, and I think his attitude as well, because he's almost countercultural in the sense that he puts up different people linked to disability, gender identity, and race, and he elevates them in his art. And I think really what he's been trying to do is just to show again that idea of diversity. So I mean, there would be a really good example whereby I'm not separating myself out in terms of just looking for black role models, because if you know about Nick Knight, he is actually white. But then there would be other artists such as Sado Kaita, I might not have pronounced that properly, who is a African portrait photographer. And I think it's just the style and sensibility that he brought to his work and the intimacy that I kind of appreciate. So there's a wide range. Another artist might be Erwin Olaf, and he's Dutch, and he carries within his work quite a lot of narrative to do with life and loss, and sexually he is homosexual, so a lot of that comes through and is communicated in his work. So it's a wide range. I'm so sorry, I can't give you a singular person.
And I bet it is a lot of them, but you already said like a few good ones, and yeah, it is this. No, like we've got like a lot of things that comes and goes as well. No, you watch something, then you just identify yourself, and then you pick up a little bit of that as well.
Yeah. So I think for me, looking at things like Instagram and Pinterest are quite interesting mediums to follow, because then you're sort of like open to different types of influence, etc. The thing that I actually miss quite a bit, part because of where I am, is some of the more heavier academic photographers, etc., that I think that I need to return to. So I think it would be that I need to maybe just focus a little bit more on so I can produce a more considered body of work. But life wasn't built in a day.
No, definitely not.
Oh, sorry, Rome wasn't built in a day. Yeah.
And how do you think about the representativeness on the media, like on television? Principal like on public television, because when you access like Instagram and Pinterest, we quite have like a filter ourselves as well. We pick what we are interested in. But for the like public medias, like a newspaper and television, how do you think that? Do you think that's representative enough in there? Like they represent like the culture and the ethnics like on the right way? What do you think about that?
I think it's a very complicated landscape, only because, as you are aware, the situation today is heavily influenced by issues linked to Black Lives Matter, and a sort of an almost universal understanding that perhaps the representation of Black people might not have been fair, but then at the same time, and this is why it's complicated, there is some resistance to diversity of representation. So you only have to look at events which are occurring in America to do with Donald Trump to understand that we've got almost two different, demographics, whereby some people understand that there is a need for change, and then you have another demographic who are heavily resistant, and they are also saying, what about all lives matter, as if that is sufficient reason to ignore another demographic. So it's a complicated landscape, shall we say. And I think maybe just as a closing remark, and that it does occur. I don't know if you've seen Famalan. I've seen a few, but the Black community are aware of the way that artificial families are created for adverts, where you have mixed race families, etc., so that they're covering all the boxes and cannot be accused of ignoring sort of like certain demographics. And I understand why it's happening, but I think we probably need to be a little bit more nuanced in the way that we put adverts out and different representations of specific groups. And that's not just Black identity, it might also be linked to disability and sexual orientation. So, and it's hard. I'm not saying that it can never be easy. So that's my thoughts.
No, I completely agree
on that subject.
I think exactly like that as well. Like we need so much more about everything, you know, like not just like community, but like all the different aspects of society.
Yes. Yeah, but I guess we don't have a crystal ball in terms of how media is going to develop, because we are our own media producers, and that might open up newer opportunities for advertising and endorsing products, etc. So maybe we should expect less big advertising and more little advertising, if that makes sense.
Do you mean like on the small, like on the Facebooks and these kind of things, not on the big channels, but on the small channels?
Yeah, so it could be that, or it could be product endorsers, or it could be a range of different things. So rather than it being purposely constructed, it could by I don't know, larger advertising agencies. It could be just a situation where you have a range of different adverts from different, I don't know, racial, sexual, ableism identities, which might be interesting.
It is. I think it is as well.
Yeah. I don't know, to be honest. Yeah. It could be the worst idea that I've ever thought of, but I think it's just one of those things of watch this space, because I think advertising will change.
And James, the last question before we just close this. Have you got any particular pop art or like film or a book, anything like a theater play that you identify yourself, that you think that's represents you? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I honestly, that's such a difficult one. Because again, it just goes back to that thing. I don't know whether it's me not being able to decide or not being able to identify a specific moment, but I think I came to photography and visual arts through painting. So one of my favorite painters was Van Gogh, and as a result, it just took me on a journey. But then with regards to a specific media and media form, it's really, really difficult, because there's certain films that have impacted on me, such as 12 Years a Slave, which I struggled to watch again, because I think for me it was quite horrific, and so as a result, it may be that again it might just be a wide variety of sources. I kind of gravitate maybe to some historical forms of media, so something that's got a bit of a context. So yeah, things like that, and also Mississippi's Burning, Do the Right Thing, and quite a few Spike Lee's films, simply because they've got that mixture between the humour and the serious. So, and I think maybe also content which has a degree of activism associated with it. So I'm sure that you're aware that I think even with Steve McQueen's work, he's trying to communicate a point, and also with Spike Lee. And then there's also, I'm really sorry about this, Lorna Simpson, who is both a photographer and, I don't know, text-based artist whose work absolutely is thought-provoking. So there you have it. You can see I'm a man who can't make his mind up.
But that's a good thing.
yeah, it is. But I'm just letting you know, it's not one thing. Yeah.
No, yeah. Oh, thank you very much, James. That will help me a lot. Yeah, you have been such a pleasure.
Yeah, and hopefully when lockdown's lifted, we might just be able to see each other again.
I hope so. We have talked about this, don't just before on the last one. Now we've got the second one already. I'm Moses. This was the interview with James Bell. Thank you for listening.